The first thing my son-in-law said, when the mediator asked him to summarize his position, was loud enough to carry across the entire conference room. Honestly, Gerald's been a financial burden on this family for years. The man worked a government salary his whole life, and has nothing to show for it. You could hear the ventilation system humming after that. I remember looking at my daughter across the table. 31 years of watching her grow up, sitting there in a cream-colored blazer, with her hands folded neatly on a stack of legal folders, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. Then I looked at the attorney sitting across from me. He'd been introduced that morning as Thomas Beaumont, lead counsel for the estate. Late 50s, silver hair, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He'd been scribbling notes since we sat down. But when my son-in-law finished speaking, Beaumont had stopped writing. He was staring at me. I said his name quietly, just his first name, Tom. His pen dropped onto the legal pad. He looked at me the way a man looks when he thinks his mind is betraying him. Then something shifted in his face, all the professional composure draining out of it at once. He stood up. "Gerald Hutchins," he said, and suddenly, the conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Cleveland office building didn't feel so cold anymore. My son-in-law, whose name is Philip, looked from Beaumont to me with visible alarm. He'd spent the last hour painting me as a confused old retiree who'd mismanaged my late wife's estate and was now clinging to assets I had no right to keep. He'd been enjoying himself right up until that moment. Now he looked like a man whose shoelace had just caught fire. Thomas Beaumont sat back down slowly, though his eyes never left my face. "Can we take a brief recess?" he said to the mediator. 15 minutes. My daughter finally looked at me. Not with warmth exactly, more like the expression you make when the ground shifts unexpectedly beneath your feet. I just sat there with my hands folded on the table, feeling every one of my 67 years settle into my joints all at once. That was the moment my daughter realized she didn't know everything about the man she'd been trying to push out of her mother's house. But to explain how we got there, I need to go back a bit. I grew up in Sandusky, Ohio, about an hour west of Cleveland along the lake. My father worked the line at a Ford assembly plant and came home every evening, smelling like machine oil and honest effort. My mother taught 4th grade for 32 years. Neither of them had much money, but I never once doubted that I mattered to them. I became a firefighter at 23, not because it was glamorous. In 1980, nobody was making firefighting glamorous. I did it because my father's oldest friend had done it, and because I'd watched that man carry himself through every hard thing life threw at him with a kind of quiet steadiness I wanted for myself. I spent 34 years with the Cleveland Fire Department. Most of those years I don't talk about much, not because they weren't meaningful, because the meaningful parts are hard to explain to people who weren't there. My wife Beverly and I met at a church potluck in 1983. She brought a green bean casserole that was, objectively, the worst thing I had ever tasted. I told her so, gently, and she laughed so hard, she nearly knocked her paper cup off the folding table. I thought, there's someone who can take a joke and give one back. That was enough for me. We were married 9 months later in a small ceremony at her parents' place in Mentor. We bought a 2-story colonial in Parma with a leaky basement and a backyard big enough for the dog Beverly always wanted. We raised our daughter Claire in that house. We drove used cars and took road trips to national parks and ate dinner at the kitchen table every night we possibly could. We were not glamorous people. We were just steady, and for a long time, steady felt like more than enough. After I retired in 2014, things changed slowly. Beverly was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's in 2016. I became her primary caregiver, which meant the part-time consulting work I'd picked up quietly disappeared from my schedule, and the savings I'd planned to stretch across our retirement years began moving faster than I'd projected. We adjusted. That's what you do. Beverly passed in March of 2021, peaceful, at home, the way she wanted. Claire flew in from Atlanta with Philip and their 2 kids. I was grateful for that. What I didn't understand, not right away, was that the visit wasn't only about grieving. Philip is the kind of man who reads every financial statement like he's looking for an error he's owed. He manages mid-level operations for a logistics firm, makes comfortable money, and has spent the better part of a decade quietly implying that I should have done more with my career, that I should have invested earlier, that a government pension, even a good one, was evidence of limited ambition. Beverly had inherited her mother's house in Lakewood after her mom died in 2019. It wasn't worth a fortune. 3 bedrooms, updated kitchen, about 4 blocks from the lake. But it was paid off, and in Beverly's will she had left it to me with the explicit instruction that I could live in it or sell it as I saw fit. Philip didn't see it that way. He found an estate attorney, hired her quietly, and spent several months building a case that Beverly had not been fully competent when the will was amended in 2019. He argued the Lakewood house should revert to Claire as next of kin. Claire, to her credit, seemed uncomfortable with the process. But she didn't stop it either. That was how I found myself in a mediation session on a Tuesday morning in October, across a conference table from my own daughter, and a man who'd been married into my family for 11 years, watching them try to take the last thing my wife had left me. The attorney they'd retained had recommended mediation as a first step before litigation. Philip had agreed, probably because he thought I'd fold. At 67, living alone on a pension, with no lawyer of my own beyond a friend from church who specialized in small business contracts, I suppose I looked like easy work. He wasn't entirely wrong about my resources, but he didn't know everything. When Thomas Beaumont came back into the conference room after the recess, he walked differently, more carefully, like a man recalculating distances. He sat down, removed his reading glasses, and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I need to disclose something to all parties," he said to the mediator. "I have a prior acquaintance with Mr. Hutchins. I want the record to reflect that and to confirm I can proceed impartially." Philip leaned toward Claire and whispered something. She shook her head slightly. Beaumont continued without looking at either of them. "I'd also like to request a brief private conversation with Mr. Hutchins before we proceed." 10 minutes. Philip's attorney stood immediately. "I'd like to object to any ex parte." "You're welcome to object," Beaumont said evenly. "I'm still going to ask." I followed a paralegal down a short hallway to a smaller room with a round table and a window overlooking a parking garage. Beaumont came in a minute later and closed the door. For a moment he just stood there, shaking his head slowly. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "Been a while," I said. "Gerald." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily like a man whose legs had decided to quit before the rest of him. "I looked for you, you know, after. That surprised me." "You did? You disappeared. Beverly got a job offer in Parma. We moved. Life." He nodded slowly. "Life." The word landed with weight, the way it tends to once you're past 60. "You remember that night?" I gave him a tired half smile. "I remember every time the weather gets cold." And just like that, I was back in it. February of 1994. A fire in a 4-story apartment building off Lorraine Avenue on the west side of Cleveland. 3 in the morning, below freezing, wind coming off the lake hard enough to make the aerial ladders sway. Buildings like that one, older construction, they burn fast and unpredictably. Floors collapse before anybody's ready. Tom Beaumont had been a young assistant county prosecutor at the time. He'd been visiting a friend in the building, a witness in a corruption case he was building. He'd been on the 3rd floor when the stairwell gave way. By the time my crew reached that section of the building, the floor below Beaumont's position had partially collapsed. He was on a section of corridor that was going to follow it in a matter of minutes. We could hear the structure talking, that low grinding sound that every firefighter learns to fear. My lieutenant ordered us back to the secondary stairwell. I didn't go. Maybe that was reckless. Maybe it was just instinct. 30 years later, I still can't fully separate the two. I went in with one other firefighter, a young guy from Youngstown, who'd been on the job 11 months. We reached Beaumont in about 90 seconds. The ceiling above him was already beginning to sag. He had a gash across his forehead from falling debris and was disoriented but standing. He grabbed my arm and said, "There's a woman, apartment 3C. I told him we'd come back. He said he wasn't leaving without confirmation she was out. Even then, in that situation, I respected him for that. She was already out. A neighbor had gotten her down the exterior fire escape 20 minutes earlier. I found out afterward from the incident report, but in that moment I didn't know, and Tom didn't know, and he refused to move until I told him she was safe. I told him she was safe. I don't know if that was a lie or a reasonable assumption. I made the call I had to make. We got out with about 40 seconds to spare before that section of the corridor came down completely. I tore cartilage in my left knee on the exterior stairs. Never quite healed properly. Cold mornings I can still feel exactly where it happened. Back in the conference room in that smaller side office, Beaumont reached into his jacket pocket and removed something. He set it on the table between us. It was a Cleveland Fire Department challenge coin. Old, worn smooth on the edges. The kind that gets handled often. I stared at it. I hadn't seen that coin in decades. "You gave it to me in the ambulance," he said. "Told me it was for people who'd come through something they weren't supposed to survive." I almost smiled. "Sounds about right." "It's been in my pocket ever since." He paused. 30 years, Gerald." I looked at the coin for a moment without speaking. Outside, I could hear traffic noise from the street 14 floors below. The ordinary sound of the city going about its business, indifferent to whatever happened in this room. Beaumont leaned forward. "Tell me what's actually going on out there." So I told him. All of it. Beverly's illness, the caregiving years, the Lakewood house, what my wife had wanted. Philip's case. Claire's silence. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Did your wife understand what she was doing when she made that amendment?" "Completely," I said. "She called her attorney herself. She told me afterward. She wanted to make sure I had somewhere to land." Beaumont nodded once. "That's what I thought." He looked toward the window. The parking garage view wasn't much, but he seemed to find something in it. "Your son-in-law's attorney is going to argue that your pension income should offset your claim to the property," he said. "That you don't need it. I know. You do need it. I know that too." He leaned back in his chair. "Gerald, there's something else. Something your daughter may not be fully aware of." I raised an eyebrow. He opened his portfolio and removed a printed document. "After you gave me that coin, I made it a habit to follow up on the people who came out of significant incidents I was connected to, professionally and personally." He looked at me carefully. "Your department gave you a commendation in 1998 for the Lorraine Avenue incident. But that's not all I found." He set the document on the table. It was a printout of a news article from 2003. A family of 4 pulled from a partially collapsed residential structure after a gas explosion in Euclid. My name was in the 3rd paragraph. He set another one beside it, a letter photocopied from a former Cleveland City councilman. Dated 2008. It referenced a fire at a senior center in Old Brooklyn and a firefighter who'd gone back twice after the official, all clear to confirm 2 residents were accounted for. "I didn't go looking for these to build a case," Beaumont said. "I kept them because men like you are rare, and the world has a way of forgetting that quickly. I looked away from the documents because my eyes were doing something I didn't need them doing right now." "There's also this," he said. He slid a folded letter across the table. The handwriting on the outside was shaky but deliberate. I recognized it immediately. Beverly had written it. I could tell by the way she formed her lowercase letters. The slight leftward lean she'd had since arthritis settled into her writing hand in her last years. "Your daughter brought this to the initial consultation as evidence that your wife was confused and sentimental in her final years," Beaumont said quietly. "Philip's attorney submitted it to demonstrate emotional rather than legal intent." I unfolded it carefully. Beverly had written it 2 weeks before she passed. It was addressed to Claire. "Your father gave up more than you know. He never talks about it, because that's not the kind of man he is. But I want you to understand something clearly before I'm gone. He sold his retirement boat in 2017 to cover my specialist visits when our out-of-pocket ran over. He took night work doing fire safety inspections for 3 years after. His knee started giving him trouble, and he never said a word about it to anyone. He sat beside me every single night for 4 years and read to me even when I couldn't always remember the plot. From one night to the next. I am leaving him that house because he earned it 10 times over. Not because I was confused, but because I was more clear-eyed in those years than I had been in decades. Please trust that. Please take care of him. Love, Mom. By the time I reached the last line, I couldn't speak. I sat there in that conference room chair, 67 years old, and felt the full weight of 4 years of caregiving, of silence, of doing the things that needed doing without looking for credit, settle into my chest all at once. Beaumont waited. Finally, he said, "She knew exactly what she was doing." I nodded without looking up. "And your daughter," he said carefully. I don't think she fully understood what she was asking once processed to override. I thought about Claire, about the way she'd looked at me across that conference table that morning. Not cruel, not hateful, just somewhere far away. Like she'd gotten so caught up in Philip's framing of things that she'd stopped asking her own questions. "She's not a bad person," I said. "No," Beaumont agreed. "She's a person who married someone, very good at making things seem logical." He gathered the documents together and stood. "I'm going to go have a word with the mediator. There are some procedural matters I need to raise before we reconvene." He paused at the door. "Gerald, I want to be honest with you. My professional obligation is to my client and to this process. But you should know that I intend to make certain everyone in that room understands what they're actually looking at here." I nodded. That was all I needed to hear. When we walked back into the conference room together, the shift was immediate. Philip noticed it first. He straightened in his chair and leaned toward his attorney, whispering something fast. She shook her head slightly and put a hand on his arm. Claire looked from Beaumont to me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years. Uncertainty. Philip's attorney stood the moment we sat down. "Before we continue, I'd like to note for the record that any prior relationship between opposing counsel and—" "There is no opposing counsel," Beaumont said calmly. "I am the estate attorney. I represent the integrity of your mother's documented wishes. That has not changed." The mediator asked everyone to be seated. Proceedings resumed. Financial testimony first. My pension income, the property valuation, comparable sales in Lakewood. The usual arithmetic people use to reduce a life to numbers. Then Philip's attorney made her move. "Mr. Hutchins," she began, straightening a page in her folder, "would you agree that your current income is sufficient to secure alternative housing?" "I could find somewhere to rent," I said. "Yes. And would you agree that the emotional attachment to a particular property doesn't constitute a legal right to retain it?" "That depends on the will," I said. She smiled. "Of course. But setting aside the will for a moment, I'd rather not set aside the will," I said. "My wife wrote it. She was of sound mind. I'd like it respected." The mediator made a note. The attorney pivoted. "Mr. Hutchins, isn't it true that during your wife's illness, significant financial decisions were made that reduced the estate's overall value?" "I paid for my wife's medical care," I said. "Yes, using estate assets, using our savings, which were joint assets, which is what you do when your wife is sick." Philip exhaled sharply through his nose. The attorney pressed forward. "And isn't it true that you made these decisions unilaterally, without consulting your daughter?" I looked at Claire when I answered. "My daughter lives in Atlanta. She was raising 2 children and managing her career. I didn't wake her up at 2 in the morning to discuss medication adjustments or specialist fees. I handled what needed handling. That's what Beverly needed me to do." Claire looked down at the table. Then something happened that no one in the room expected. Claire said, "That's enough." Her attorney blinked. Philip turned to look at her. I said, "That's enough." Her voice was quiet but steady. She reached into her own folder and removed the letter. Beverly's letter. The one Philip's team had submitted as evidence of confusion. "I'd like this read into the record," she said. Philip put a hand on her arm. "Claire, don't." She moved her arm away, not dramatically, just moved it. She read the letter aloud. All of it. Her voice cracked once, on the line about my knee, but she kept going. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Then she looked at me, and for the first time since Beverly died, I saw my daughter looking at me the way she used to when she was young. Not through Philip's explanations, not through her own grief-fogged assumptions. Just looking at me, I didn't know about the boat, she said. There was no reason for you to, I told her. Dad. She stopped. Started again. I didn't know about the night inspections. It needed doing. She pressed her lips together. I knew you were struggling after Mom died. I thought. She paused. Philip said you weren't managing well, that you needed structure. That maybe the house was too much. The house is the only place I sleep well, I said honestly. Philip set down his pen carefully. The room had entirely escaped his control, and he knew it. His attorney tried one more time. Perhaps we should redirect to the financial. No, Claire said. She looked at the mediator. I'd like to pause this process. I need to speak with my father privately. The hallway outside the conference room had a row of windows looking east over downtown Cleveland. November sky, gray and flat. The kind of day this city does better than almost anywhere. There's an honesty to it. No pretending it's nicer than it is. Claire stood beside me looking out for a moment without speaking. How long were you doing the night work? She finally asked. About 3 years. After my knee made the active inspections harder. You never told me you had enough going on. She turned to face me. She looked like Beverly around the eyes. She always had. That's not a reason, that's an excuse. That surprised me into a quiet laugh. You sound like your mother. Good. She folded her arms, not defensively, more like she was holding something and that needed holding. Dad, I owe you an apology. You don't. I do. I let Philip talk me into seeing this situation through his lens. He made it sound reasonable, practical. And I was still so angry and sad about losing Mom that I think I needed somewhere to put that energy. I looked out at the gray sky over the city. Your mother used to say grief makes people do math wrong, I said. Assign blame to the wrong column. Claire wiped beneath one eye quickly. She would say that. We stood there a while longer without talking, which, honestly, was more comfortable than it had been in years. What did Tom Beaumont say to you in there? She finally asked. Old memories, I said. He knew you. From a long time ago. She waited. I could tell she wanted more, but she didn't push. That was new. Philip had taught her to press for information like it was a negotiating tactic. Somewhere underneath that, my daughter still knew how to be patient. There was a fire, I said. 1994. I went in after someone who didn't need to be there. He was a young prosecutor trying to do the right thing. Got turned around in a bad situation. Claire watched me carefully. I got him out. That's all. That's not all, she said. It was 30 years ago. Dad. She said it the way Beverly used to, when she thought I was being deliberately dense. The man has carried your challenge coin in his pocket for 30 years. I didn't have an answer for that. You know what the hardest part of this whole thing has been, she asked. Not the legal stuff. Not even Mom being gone. She looked at her hands. Realizing I stopped asking about your life somewhere along the way. I knew your pension amount. I knew your medical history. I knew which medications you were taking. She looked up. But I didn't know the things that mattered. That statement sat between us in the hallway for a long moment. You were busy, I said. I was private. Both things were true at the same time. That's generous. It's honest. She exhaled slowly. Philip is going to be angry. Probably. He had a lot invested in this outcome. I know. She looked out the window again. I think I've let him manage too many things that weren't his to manage. I didn't say anything to that. It wasn't my place to press the point. After a moment, she said quietly, Mom's letter. The line about reading to her every night. She liked mysteries, I said. We got through a lot of them in those 4 years. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth briefly, then lowered it. I wish I'd been here more. You were here when it counted. I wasn't, though. Not really. She turned to face me again. I'm going to withdraw from the mediation. The house is yours. I should have said that 6 months ago. I nodded once. Thank you. I'm sorry it took this long, Claire. I waited until she looked at me directly. Your mother wasn't angry at you. She understood. I need you to know that. She nodded, not quite able to speak for a moment. She talked about you right up until the end, I said. About your kids. About the way you used to argue with her about music at breakfast when you were 15. She laughed about that more than once. A sound escaped Claire that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. somewhere in between. That argument was completely justified, she finally managed. She had terrible taste in country music. She really did, I agreed. And for a moment, standing in that hallway, in downtown Cleveland, it felt like some kind of bridge was still there. Bent and stressed and maybe overdue for maintenance, but still there. 3 months later, I was sitting on the back porch of the Lakewood house on a Saturday afternoon in February, watching ice move on the lake. Cold enough to see your breath. The kind of afternoon that has its own particular silence. I'd started sleeping better. Not perfectly. Some nights the old memories surface loud enough to pull me awake. But better. I'd gotten back in touch with the department's peer support program. They run a veterans and retirees group that meets Wednesday mornings at a fire station in Westlake. Mostly older guys, some newer. Nobody makes you talk. Sometimes you just sit there and drink bad coffee, and that's enough. I'd also started helping with fire safety inspections on a volunteer basis, light work, no ladders. Mostly just walking through senior residential buildings and going over escape routes with residents who'd never thought about it seriously. There's something valuable about sitting with an 80-year-old woman who lives alone on the 3rd floor and making sure she knows which window to go to if the stairwell fills with smoke. It matters to her. It grounds me. That trade works. One Thursday afternoon, I looked up from the paperwork I was reviewing, and Tom Beaumont was standing in the doorway. He was holding 2 coffees from the cafe down the block, which told me he'd planned ahead. "How'd you find me here?" I asked. "You're not hard to find when you want to be useful somewhere," he said. He pulled up a chair. We drank the coffee. Neither of us talked much for a while, which felt right. Eventually he asked, "How's Claire?" "Better," I said. "She and Philip are in counseling. I don't know where that goes. But she's asking her own questions again, which is an improvement." Beaumont nodded. "Good. She brought the grandkids up last month. We took them to the science center." "How was that?" "Loud," I said. "I liked it." He smiled at that. A minute passed. Outside, a gull coasted past the window on the wind off the lake, barely moving its wings. "You know," Beaumont said, "when I stood up in that conference room and saw you sitting there, my first thought was that I'd imagined it. I probably looked different and exactly the same," he said. "That's the strange part." I understood what he meant. Time does that, wears the surface down while leaving the structure intact. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and tell me if it's none of my business. Ask. The night inspection work, the caregiving years, all of it." He looked at me directly. "Did you ever ask for help?" "I thought about that honestly." "Once," I said. "I called a department chaplain in 2019. We talked for about an hour. He was helpful," Beaumont repeated. "Men from my generation I started." "I know," he said. "Mine too. Doesn't make it right." I nodded slowly. "No, it doesn't." He set down his coffee cup. "There's something I want to show you." He reached into his coat and removed a folded piece of paper from the clerk of courts. It's a commendation request, filed by a property owner in Euclid, whose building you helped clear in 2003. She passed away in 2018. Her daughter found it while going through her papers. She thought it should still be submitted. I stared at the document. 20 years later, I said, "People don't forget." Beaumont said simply, "I looked at that piece of paper for a long time. Not because of what it meant officially, because of what it meant that a woman I'd never met in the last years of her life had taken the time to write it out. She described you," he said, "in her own words. She wrote, 'He talked to me like I was a person, not a problem to be managed. He made sure I understood what was happening. He came back to check on me after his shift ended.'" I set the paper down carefully. "You kept showing up," Beaumont said quietly. "For strangers, for your wife, for a city that mostly didn't notice. That's the whole of it, Gerald. That's the record." I looked out toward the lake for a moment. "Beverly used to say the measure of a life isn't how loud you lived it," I said. "It's how many people slept a little better because you were there." Beaumont was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Smart woman. Terrible taste in country music," I said. He laughed. It was a real laugh. The kind that surprises you out of a serious moment. 6 months after the mediation ended, Claire drove up from Atlanta with the kids for a long weekend. Her oldest, my grandson Robbie, who is 12, and currently obsessed with anything related to engineering, spent an entire Saturday morning asking me questions about how buildings burn and why certain materials behave differently under heat and how fire investigators figure out where a fire started. I answered every question as honestly as I could. At one point, he looked at me and said, "Grandpa, were you ever scared?" I thought about that seriously, the way I would have wanted someone to answer it when I was 12. "Every time," I said. He frowned. "But you kept going in anyway." "That's what scared means, Robbie. Scared doesn't mean you stop. It means you pay attention." He sat with that for a minute. "Is that what being brave is?" he asked. I looked at him across the workbench in my garage, this 12-year-old kid with his mother's eyes and a mind that never stops moving. "I think brave is smaller than people make it sound," I told him. "Most of the time it's just deciding to do the next right thing, even when you'd rather not." He nodded slowly, turning that over. Later that afternoon, Claire found me on the back porch watching the lake again. She sat down beside me without a word and handed me a mug of coffee. We sat there together in the February wind. After a while, she said, "I found the inspection logs from when you were working nights." I didn't say anything. 312 inspections, she said, between 2016 and 2019. Still, I didn't answer. "You did that while you were caring for Mom." "She slept in the afternoons," I said. "I had time." Claire shook her head slowly, but not in frustration, in something that looked more like recognition. Like she was finally seeing a picture that had been in front of her all along, just too close to focus on properly. "She knew," Claire said quietly. "Didn't she? About all of it." Your mother knew everything," I said. "She just let me believe I was keeping secrets. That was her way of letting me keep my dignity." Claire laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like her." The lake was steel gray and moving steadily out toward the horizon, seagulls working the cold air. The ordinary beauty of a place that doesn't need you to notice it to keep being beautiful. "I'm going to come up more often," Claire said. "Not because of legal business or because I'm worried about you. Just because, I'd like that," I said. She leaned her head briefly against my shoulder, like she used to when she was small. Like, some things bend but don't break if you give them enough time and enough honesty. Robbie appeared in the doorway then, coat half zipped, holding a notebook full of questions. "Grandpa," he announced, "I have 17 more things I want to ask you." Claire straightened up. "He's been counting," she said. "I can see that," I said. I set down my coffee and waved him over. Because some things are worth getting to, even when it takes longer than it should. Even when the road there was harder and lonelier than anyone knew to ask about. And if this story puts someone in your mind, a parent, a neighbor, a veteran, a caregiver, someone who kept showing up quietly while the world looked the other way, I hope you'll find them this week and let them know you see them. Because the people carrying the most are usually the ones asking for the least.